In this galaxy, the Aeldari never fell, humanity never rose, and the stars themselves sing their supremacy. The last thing you expect in the void is music, but that is what reaches you first. Not the grinding machinery of a cargo hauler or the distant thunder of orbital batteries, but something older, something that makes your spine remember it was once designed to bend in submission. The sound crawls through the hull plating of your transport vessel, bypassing every rational filter your mind possesses. And for one terrible moment you understand that you are hearing something your species was never meant to comprehend. The Aeldari do not broadcast their presence through crude vox channels or blunt electromagnetic pulses. They sing reality itself into compliance, and every sentient creature within range instinctively knows they are in the presence of something that renders the concept of threat utterly meaningless. Your commanding officer, a man who once stood before an orc war boss, without flinching, begins to weep. Not from fear, though fear is certainly present, coiling in your gut like a living thing. He weeps because some buried genetic memory, some ancestral knowledge coded into humanity's very chromosomes, recognizes the Aeldari for what they truly are. Masters. Not conquerors or tyrants or any crude approximation your limited vocabulary might offer, but something far more absolute. The universe bent itself around their will long before your ancestors learned to kindle fire, and in this timeline, in this reality that never knew the screaming birth of she who thirsts, it never stopped bending. The webway gate manifests 300,000 kilometers off your starboard bow. The sensors struggle. The Mechanicus acolytes aboard your vessel begin muttering prayers to the Omnissiah, but their litanies sound hollow against the sheer antiquity of what they witness. The gate is not constructed from matter, as humanity understands it. Wraithbone and psychoplastic flow together in geometries that make your eyes water, structures that exist simultaneously in real space and the Imperium, architecture that was ancient when Terra's sun was young. Through that portal you glimpse something that makes every fiber of your being scream in a strange mixture of awe and despair. You see the heart of an empire that never fell, and the sight burns itself into your memory with such clarity that you know you will carry it until the moment of your death, and quite possibly beyond. The Aeldari cruiser that emerges flows rather than moves. It does not crudely shove its way through space like the primitive designs of lesser species. The vessel measures 30 kilometers from bow to stern, yet it barely registers on your gravitational sensors because the Aeldari mastered the art of divorcing mass from matter millennia before your Imperium stumbled into existence. The hull shimmers with colors that have no name in Gothic or any human tongue, hues that exist only in the deepest ranges of psychic perception. Watching it glide through the darkness feels like witnessing a knife blade cutting silk, effortless, inevitable, beautiful in a way that makes you forget, just for a moment, that you are looking at a weapon platform capable of reducing your entire battle group to component atoms without any member of its crew needing to look up from their contemplations. Your captain does not order evasive maneuvers. There would be no point. The Aeldari could have destroyed you at any moment since you entered this sector, probably knew you were coming before you received your deployment orders, and chose to reveal themselves only when it suited their inscrutable purposes. Instead, he activates the Vox and speaks the ritual words of greeting that every human vessel venturing into the galactic core has learned to recite. The phrases are in High Eltharin, though the translation provided to Imperial commanders renders only the crudest approximation. You are stating your species, your purpose, your humble acknowledgement that you traverse territories held by right of conquest so ancient that the very bedrock of the galaxy's oldest worlds bears the psychic imprint of Aeldari claim. You are begging permission to exist in their presence. The response comes directly into the minds of every soul aboard your ship. The psychic contact is gentle, almost apologetic in its restraint, but you feel the vast ocean of consciousness behind it. The Farseer who addresses your captain does so with a voice like crystal singing in vacuum. She speaks in Gothic, though her thoughts carry nuances and meanings that your primitive language cannot fully contain. She grants you passage through this system, permits your continued existence. offers directions to the neutral trading station that represents one of the few points of contact between the Aeldari Empire and the lesser species that inhabit the galaxy's fringes. Her tone carries neither contempt nor warmth. You are simply too far beneath notice to warrant either emotion. An insect does not anger the scholar. It merely exists in a separate sphere of relevance. As your vessel limps toward the designated coordinates, you cannot help but stare at the view screens. The Eldari cruiser glides away into the stellar darkness. It does not return through the webway gate. That would be inefficient. Instead, it simply transitions out of real space, slipping between dimensions with such casual ease that your navigator begins screaming. The woman has spent 40 years staring into the roiling madness of the warp, has guided ships through psychic storms that would shred lesser minds. But watching the Aeldari perform in seconds, what would take her days of agonizing concentration, breaks something fundamental in her psyche. She will recover, the ship's medicae assures you, but she will never be quite the same. No one who witnesses the Aeldari's mastery over the Imperium ever is. The trading station rises before you like a monument to impossible geometries. The Aeldari section spirals upward in towers of wraithbone, buildings that seem to grow rather than having been built, each surface alive with subtle motion as the psycho-reactive material responds to the thoughts and emotions of those who traverse its halls. The lighting shifts through spectrums that human eyes can barely process, and the very air thrums with a low-level psychic resonance that makes your teeth ache. Here, in these soaring corridors where art and architecture blend seamlessly with function and form, you see what humanity lost before it ever had the chance to find it. The Eldari did not merely master technology, they transcended the very concept, reaching a state where the distinction between the created and the creator becomes meaningless. In the human quarter, everything is crude and angular, ferrocrete and plasteel, harsh lumens that cast shadows instead of illuminating with the gentle radiance of psychic light. Your people cluster in these familiar spaces like animals seeking the comfort of their den, instinctively avoiding prolonged exposure to Aeldari perfection. There is a madness that lurks in that exposure, a creeping awareness of your own species' fundamental inadequacy that can shatter the most stalwart mind. The Imperium learned this lesson in the earliest days of contact with the unbroken Aeldari Empire, and the Officio Prefectus maintains strict psychological screening protocols for anyone assigned to these border regions. Some truths are too terrible for the human psyche to bear indefinitely. The trader you have come to meet occupies a neutral chamber, one of the few spaces where both species can coexist without either party suffering undue strain. He is human, but decades of proximity to the Eldari have left their mark. His eyes hold a depth that makes you uncomfortable, a suggestion of perception beyond the normal limits of your species. When he speaks, his words carry harmonics that should not exist in a baseline human throat. He welcomes you with practiced efficiency, and you note the way his gaze flickers constantly to the chronometer on the wall, measuring time not in the standard Imperial divisions, but in cycles that align with some Aeldari calculation you cannot begin to fathom. Even here, in this refuge from their overwhelming presence, their influence seeps through every interaction. The transaction you conduct is simple on the surface. Your vessel carries a cargo of raw materials, heavy metals, and radioactive elements harvested from the dead worlds of the galactic rim. The Eldari have little use for such things themselves, their civilization having long since moved beyond dependence on crude matter, but they trade them to other species as one might distribute scraps from a feast. In exchange, you receive technological artifacts that the Mechanicus will study for decades without fully comprehending. A data slate containing architectural principles that will allow the construction of hive cities 10 times more efficient than current Imperial designs. A medical scanner that can diagnose and treat diseases your species has not yet evolved the capacity to suffer from. Tools and knowledge, always carefully measured, never enough to elevate humanity to true peer status, but sufficient to maintain the appearance of mutually beneficial exchange. The trader explains the limitations as he always does, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who has repeated these words 1,000 times. The Eldari do not restrict humanity out of cruelty or fear of competition. Such concerns would be laughable to a species whose psychic might could extinguish Terra's sun with a focused thought. They limit the flow of knowledge because they have witnessed, across millions of years of galactic history, what happens when young species receive power beyond their wisdom to wield it. They have watched promising civilizations annihilate themselves with weapons they barely understood, seen entire sectors rendered lifeless by the careless application of technologies that required millennia of philosophical and ethical development to use safely. The Eldari do not view themselves as parents carefully dosing medicine to children, though the metaphor is apt enough. They simply understand that the universe possesses certain fundamental laws, and attempting to circumvent the natural progression of a species' development inevitably leads to catastrophe. You think about what might happen if humanity could somehow access the full breadth of Aeldari knowledge. If your forge worlds could study their reactors that draw power from stars without touching them. If your warships could mount weapons that strike through dimensional barriers. If your psykers could be trained in the methods that allow even the least of the Aeldari to manipulate reality with casual grace. The fantasy lasts only a moment before reality reasserts itself. Your species would destroy itself within a generation. The political fragmentation alone would ensure it. Every faction would race to weaponize the new technologies. Every ambitious lord would seek to carve out his own empire, and the resulting wars would make the Horus heresy look like a border skirmish. The Eldari understand this. They have always understood this. In this timeline where their empire never shattered, where she who thirsts never tore a wound through the galaxy's heart and birthed the Eye of Terror, they continue to watch and wait as they have for epochs beyond counting. They are not humanity's guardians or protectors. Those concepts imply a relationship of care or obligation that simply does not exist. The Eldari maintain the lesser species much as a gardener maintains various plots of land, observing growth patterns, occasionally pruning back particularly aggressive weeds, ensuring that no single element overwhelms the whole. Humanity exists in this galaxy because the Eldari permit it. The Orcs survive because their unique psychic gestalt field provides useful data for Aeldari researchers studying group consciousness phenomena. The Tau expand because their nascent empire serves as an interesting experiment in accelerated technological development. Everything exists at the pleasure of the eldest children of the cosmos. The weight of this reality presses down upon you as you complete your transaction and return to your ship. Your commanding officer, recovered somewhat from his earlier breakdown, speaks quietly about the mission briefings he has read, classified documents that never leave the vaults of the administratum's highest levels. There are theories, carefully guarded speculations about what might have happened if the Eldari had fallen as they did in what some rogue scholars whisper of as the primary timeline. In that reality, the birth of Slaanesh ripped the heart from their empire, scattered their people across the stars as refugees and exiles, reduced the species that once held the galaxy in an unbreakable grip to a handful of craft worlds clinging to survival. In that reality, humanity had room to expand, to build its own empire, to pretend at significance. But that is not this reality. In this universe, the moment of the Eldari's greatest hedonistic excess, the instant when their society should have collapsed into nightmarish damnation, simply never arrived. The warnings of the Farseers were heeded centuries before crisis point. The cults of pleasure and sensation that had begun to consume Aeldari civilization were identified and purged with ruthless efficiency. The psychic resonance that should have coalesced into a newborn god was dispersed across 1 billion carefully constructed wards and containment fields. The Eldari looked into the abyss of their own potential destruction and stepped back from the precipice with the same graceful precision that characterizes every action of their species. The cost of that salvation surfaces occasionally in the few academic circles bold enough to discuss such matters. The Eldari did not simply reform their society. They restructured it from the foundational level upward. Every citizen of the empire underwent psychic evaluation and retraining, a process that would have seemed like totalitarian nightmare if applied to any lesser species, but which the Eldari approached with the calm rationality that defines their culture. Those few individuals who could not or would not adapt to the new order were dealt with. though the exact nature of their fate remains unclear. Exile to the webway's deepest reaches, perhaps. Containment in psychic prisons where they could harm neither themselves nor others. The Aeldari do not speak of this period in their history except in the most general terms, and no human scholar possesses the context necessary to fully understand what transpired during those critical decades. What emerged from that crucible was an empire refined to near perfection. The webway, that ancient network of extra-dimensional tunnels that the Aeldari had constructed in ages past, became more than merely a transportation system. It transformed into the literal skeleton upon which their entire civilization hung. Billions of worlds and habitats connected not by vulnerable real space routes, but through corridors that existed outside the normal flow of space and time. The capital worlds, those jewels of Aeldari achievement that had never been properly catalogued by human explorers, became nexus points where art and science achieved a synthesis that redefined both concepts. Infinity circuits hummed with the stored consciousness of trillions of Aeldari who had lived and died across millennia, their accumulated wisdom available to guide and counsel the living. Your ship passes an Aeldari monitoring station as you navigate toward the system's edge. Through the viewports, you catch a glimpse of the beings who crew it. They move through their tasks with choreographed perfection, each action flowing seamlessly into the next. You realize you are watching a kind of dance. Everything the Aeldari do possesses this quality of artistic expression, from the way they pilot their vessels to the manner in which they conduct scientific research. There is no distinction in their culture between functional necessity and aesthetic beauty. The two concepts merged long ago into a unified philosophy that human minds struggle to fully grasp. One of your fellow officers, a woman who has spent time studying what little xenological data the Imperium possesses on the Aeldari, explains that this aesthetic perfection is not mere vanity or cultural affectation. It represents a fundamental aspect of how the Aeldari perceive and interact with reality. Their psychic sensitivity means that they experience existence at a level of intensity that would drive a human instantly mad. Every emotion, every sensation, every thought carries implications and resonances that ripple through both the material and immaterial realms. To maintain sanity under such conditions requires discipline of a kind that few humans could achieve, even if they trained for 1,000 years. The Aeldari channel this overwhelming sensory input through carefully constructed frameworks of art and ritual, transforming what could be paralyzing chaos into structured beauty. The officer's explanation troubles you more than it enlightens. It suggests that the Aeldari's apparent perfection is not a sign of superiority, but rather a necessary adaptation to an existence that teeters constantly on the edge of psychic dissolution. They are not gods striding through the cosmos in casual mastery, but survivors clinging to elaborate coping mechanisms that allow them to function despite the terrible burden of their own enhanced perceptions. This interpretation offers a strange kind of comfort, suggesting that perhaps humanity's psychic blindness is not an unalloyed weakness, but rather a kind of mercy. Your species cannot perceive the full horror and beauty of the universe, and perhaps that limitation is what allows you to endure without requiring the vast superstructure of discipline that the Aeldari have constructed. But such comfort dies quickly when you consider the practical realities of the galaxy you inhabit. Humanity's domains, vast by the standards of your species, represent barely a tenth of colonized space. The Aeldari Empire encompasses everything else, territory so immense that even their own records cannot fully catalogue it. Worlds beyond counting, each shaped and refined according to principles that blend ecological science with artistic vision. Dyson swarms that harvest stellar energy while simultaneously serving as canvases for light sculptures that span entire solar systems. Habitats in the deep void between stars, where the Aeldari practice forms of existence that require neither planet nor sun, consciousness housed in crystalline matrices that dream across centuries. The diversity of Aeldari civilization defies human comprehension in its scope. On some worlds, they maintain what they call living museums, entire ecosystems preserved exactly as they existed millions of years ago, complete with the less evolved forms of their own species. These are not crude displays for entertainment, but rather sacred sites where the Aeldari come to remember and honor their own progression from mere material beings to something approaching the divine. On other worlds, they conduct experiments in social engineering that span millennia, testing different forms of government and cultural organization to determine which structures best promote the continued evolution of their species. Every question that humanity has barely begun to formulate, the Eldari have already explored in exhaustive detail. Your navigator, recovered enough to resume her duties though still visibly shaken, guides your vessel toward the system's Mandeville point. The process takes longer than normal, because this region of space is saturated with subtle psychic wards and detection fields. The Eldari monitor every ship that enters or leaves their core territories, not out of paranoia but simply as a matter of efficient administration. They know your vessel's mass, composition, cargo, and crew complement with greater precision than your own ship's cognitors can calculate. They have read the psychic resonance of every soul aboard and assessed your purpose and intent. And having determined that you represent no threat to their interests, they allow you to depart as casually as you might wave away a fly. The transition into the warp comes with unexpected violence. Your navigator reports strange currents and eddies in the Imperium, patterns that should not exist in a region so thoroughly dominated by Aeldari psychic influence. For a moment, you fear some disaster, some hidden flaw in the unbroken Empire's control over the immaterial realm. But then, understanding dawns, and with it comes a fresh wave of existential terror. The disturbances are not natural phenomena. They are the psychic equivalent of contrails, the residual wake left by Eldari vessels that have recently traversed this region of the warp. Even their passage through the Imperium reshapes reality in ways that linger for days or weeks afterward, testament to the sheer magnitude of power that their civilization routinely deploys. As your ship plunges into the churning madness of the warp, you find yourself grateful for the Gela fields that shield you from the worst of its influence. The technology is crude compared to what the Eldari possess, barely sufficient to keep the daemons at bay, but it functions well enough for your purposes. You spare a thought for what it must be like to traverse the Imperium as the Aeldari do, carried through the webway's protected corridors where the warp's touch cannot reach. They do not brave the sea of souls because they lack the courage or because they fear its denizens. They simply evolved past the need to subject themselves to unnecessary risk. Why swim through an ocean of madness when you can walk through hallways that exist outside its reach entirely? The journey back to Imperial space takes subjective weeks, though in the warp time means nothing, and your ship's chronometers maintain only a tenuous connection to the calendar you departed from. Your crew uses the interval to process what they have witnessed, to try to incorporate their experiences into a worldview that has been fundamentally challenged. The Imperium teaches that humanity represents the rightful inheritors of the galaxy, that the God Emperor guides your species toward a manifest destiny that will see Terra's children ruling from the galactic core to the halo stars. But everyone who has visited the Aeldari domains knows the lie inherent in that claim. Humanity is not ascending toward greatness. You are permitted to exist in carefully designated reservations, your expansion monitored and controlled by a species that could snuff out every last human being without expending any notable effort. Some of your fellow crew members find faith their refuge from this terrible knowledge. They pray to the Emperor with renewed fervor, convinced that he will somehow elevate humanity to challenge the Xenos dominance, that his divine will shall manifest in humanity's final triumph over all obstacles. You cannot share their conviction. You have seen too much, understood too clearly the fundamental disparity between species. The Emperor, mighty as he surely is, represents at best a crude approximation of the psychic mastery that every Aeldari farseer wields as naturally as breathing. He sits upon his golden throne because humanity required a beacon through the warp, a desperate measure to compensate for your species' inadequate navigation capabilities. The Eldari needed no such sacrifice because they built the webway millions of years before. Humanity learned to work bronze. Others among the crew retreat into xenophobia, channeling their terror and humiliation into hatred of the Aeldari and all their works. They speak in low voices about the need to resist, to fight, to somehow throw off the subtle chains that bind humanity to perpetual secondary status. These individuals make you more uneasy than the religious zealots, because their anger contains the seeds of genuine catastrophe. The Imperium has strict protocols about containing anti-Eldari sentiment, not because it loves the Xenos, but because it recognizes the suicidal implications of allowing such hatred to influence policy. Any serious conflict with the Aeldari Empire would result in humanity's extinction, not gradual decline or loss of territory, but complete and total annihilation. The Aeldari possess weapons that can ignite atmospheres from orbit, devices that can age entire worlds to barren husks in minutes, psychic techniques that could drive every human mind simultaneously insane. They refrain from using such capabilities not because they lack them, but because genocide offends their aesthetic sensibilities. Then something happens that changes everything. Your commanding officer calls you to his quarters 2 days before the scheduled emergence from warp transit. His face carries an expression you have never seen before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something that makes your blood run cold before he speaks a single word. He has been reviewing reports from previous expeditions to Eldari space, classified documents that are technically above your clearance level, but which he shares anyway, because what difference do regulations make in the face of what he has discovered? There is a pattern in these reports, a recurring theme that has begun to trouble those few individuals within the administratum who possess sufficient perspective to recognize it. The Eldari are changing, not in any dramatic or immediately visible way, through subtle shifts in policy and attitude that suggest something significant is occurring within their empire. They have begun refusing certain trade requests that were previously granted without issue. They have withdrawn from several border regions that they had maintained presence in for millennia. Most concerning of all, the frequency of their communications with Imperial authorities has declined by nearly 40% over the last standard century. Your commanding officer's hands shake as he shows you the data, charts and graphs that should mean nothing but which somehow carry the weight of impending apocalypse. The implications remain unclear, but the pattern worries those who have made careers of studying the Eldari. In a civilization as ancient and stable as theirs, any change of behavior suggests corresponding shifts in thinking that may take decades or centuries to fully manifest. Perhaps they have identified some new threat, some danger lurking beyond the galactic rim, that requires their attention. Perhaps internal political developments have altered their approach to managing lesser species. Or perhaps, most terrifying of all, they have simply lost interest in maintaining the elaborate pretense of cooperation with humanity and the other young races. Your commanding officer leans forward, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. He tells you something that makes your stomach drop. 3 months ago, an entire battle group vanished while conducting routine patrols along the Eldari border, not destroyed, not driven off, simply gone, as if they had never existed. The administratum logged it as a warp accident, the kind of thing that happens with depressing regularity in a galaxy where faster-than-light travel requires bargaining with nightmares. But your commanding officer has seen the classified reports. He knows the truth. The battle group's last transmission spoke of Aeldari vessels approaching, but not with the usual studied disinterest. They came with purpose, with intent, and then silence. The weight of this revelation crushes down upon you. The Eldari could exterminate every other sapient species in the galaxy and face no consequences beyond the mild inconvenience of cleaning up the resulting debris. If they have decided that such extermination serves their interests better than continued coexistence, then there is absolutely nothing that could prevent it. Your commanding officer does not need to speak this truth aloud. You both understand it perfectly. Humanity exists because the Eldari permit it, and permissions, once granted, can always be revoked. He does not share these speculations idly. He is preparing you for a role in the intelligence apparatus that monitors Aeldari activity. Your demonstrated ability to maintain psychological equilibrium in the face of their overwhelming presence marks you as suitable for continued duty in the border regions. It is not an honor you would have chosen, but then so little in. Imperial service proceeds according to individual preference. You will return to these haunted spaces again and again, will walk among the Aeldari and their impossible works, will accumulate observations and insights that may someday help the Imperium understand its masters slightly better. It is dreadful work, eroding to the soul and dangerous to sanity, but someone must perform it. Someone must stare into the face of humanity's permanent and inescapable subordination and maintain sufficient composure to report what they observe. The ship tears back into real space with the usual violence of warp translation. You emerge in a system thousands of light-years from the Eldari core. Here, in regions that the Eldari have designated as suitable for human colonization, you can breathe slightly easier. The psychic pressure that saturates their territories has lifted, replaced by the cold, familiar darkness of normal space. Your sensors show the familiar signatures of Imperial presence, orbital stations, patrol craft. The distant gleam of forge complexes where your species struggles to maintain its technological base through endless repetition of half-understood principles. Yet even here, even in what the Imperium claims as sovereign territory, the evidence of Aeldari influence pervades everything. The system's star has been subtly modified, its output optimized through techniques that Imperial scientists cannot replicate or even properly analyze. The worlds themselves bear markers of ancient Aeldari terraforming, their biospheres adjusted and tuned to specifications that promote stability across geological timescales. Humanity did not discover these worlds so much as it was permitted to settle them, allowed to build its cities and forge its tools in spaces that the Eldari shaped and abandoned long before your species left its cradle. The question haunts you as your vessel approaches the orbital docking facilities. What if the Eldari decided tomorrow that their experiment with tolerating lesser species had run its course? What if they determined that the galaxy would function more efficiently without the chaotic disruption that humanity introduces? The answer is obvious and terrible. There would be no war, no grand final battle where humanity could at least die with dignity. There would simply be silence. The Eldari would close the webway gates, withdraw behind barriers that no human technology could breach, and within a century your species would collapse into barbarism and extinction. Cut off from interstellar trade, unable to navigate the warp efficiently, the Imperium would fragment into 10,000 isolated worlds that would wither and die in the darkness between stars. This is the reality that the Imperium's highest authorities understand but can never acknowledge publicly. Humanity exists because the Aeldari permit it. Your great crusades and conquests, your mighty fleets and warrior legions, your psychers and saints and tech priests, all of it amounts to nothing more than elaborate theater performed for an audience that barely watches and certainly does not care. You are insects building colonies in the shadow of titans, and your continued survival depends entirely upon those titans, never noticing you sufficiently to take offense at your presumption. The weeks following your return to Imperial space blur together in an endless succession of debriefings and report submissions. You sit across from inquisitorial interrogators who probe your memories with invasive psychic techniques, ensuring that you have not been compromised or subtly influenced by exposure to Aeldari presence. They find nothing because there is nothing to find. The Eldari do not need to corrupt or manipulate human agents when they can simply read human intentions directly from the warp's currents and adjust their actions accordingly. Every plan the Imperium formulates, every strategy it develops, every secret it tries to guard is known to the Eldari almost before the humans who conceive these things have fully articulated them. The Farseers read possible futures the way you might read a data slate, tracing probability streams to determine which outcomes serve their interests and acting to guide events along those paths. You are eventually cleared for continued duty and assigned to a new vessel preparing for another expedition into border regions. The cycle will continue because it must continue, because the Imperium requires constant contact with the Eldari Empire to maintain even the illusion of independent existence. Trade must flow, communications must be maintained, and a sufficient number of human personnel must be trained to interface with the Xenos overlords who truly govern galactic affairs. It is thankless work, destructive to morale and spirit, but it is necessary work nonetheless. On your last night before shipping out, You stand on an observation deck watching Terra's moon rise over the cityscape. The old world looks peaceful from this altitude, its surface gleaming with the lights of countless hives and manufactorums. Down there, in those teeming masses of humanity, very few individuals comprehend the true nature of the galaxy they inhabit. They believe in the Imperium's strength, in humanity's manifest destiny, in the God Emperor's divine protection. They do not know that their entire civilization exists on sufferance, that at any moment the Aeldari could decide to reclaim the spaces they have loaned to humanity's use. But you have walked through Aeldari territories and felt the crushing weight of their casual supremacy. You have witnessed perfection that makes humanity's greatest achievements look like crude scribblings in dirt. You have seen your navigator break under the strain of comprehending their mastery over dimensions your species can barely perceive. You have watched your commanding officer weep not from fear but from the terrible understanding that humanity's entire existence is nothing more than a footnote in someone else's story. And you will carry that knowledge back into the darkness between stars, will stand once more before the species that evolution granted millions of years of advantage and a genetic predisposition towards psychic sensitivity that your kind will never possess. The transport lifts from the surface, carrying you back into void and uncertainty. Somewhere in the distance, through dimensions you cannot perceive, the Aeldari go about their incomprehensible business. They are crafting reality itself into new configurations, bending the fundamental laws of physics and metaphysics to serve their vision of cosmic order. They are composing symphonies that will play across centuries, writing poetry that requires the movement of entire star systems to fully appreciate. They are breeding new forms of life in sealed laboratories, exploring states of consciousness that transcend the individual entirely, mapping the deepest reaches of the Imperium with tools and techniques that humanity will never possess. And somewhere, in the highest spires of their impossible cities, the Farseers are making decisions that will determine whether your species survives another millennium or whether the experiment has finally run its course. You will never know which future they choose until it manifests. You will never understand the criteria by which they judge such matters. You can only continue your appointed rounds, walking the border between humanity's desperate pretensions and the Aeldari's eternal dominance, gathering intelligence that may or may not make any difference in the end. In the grand sweep of cosmic history, your species represents barely an eye blink. Humanity has existed as a spacefaring civilization for less than 30 millennia, a duration so brief as to be essentially meaningless when measured against the Aeldari's millions of years of continuous dominance. Yet in that brief span, you have watched your people reach desperately towards significance, building ever larger structures and ever more powerful weapons in a futile attempt to matter on the galactic stage. Every Gloriana-class battleship, every Titan Legion, every fortress world bristling with orbital defenses, all of it is ultimately pointless when measured against the reality of Aeldari supremacy. They do not fear your weapons because they possess the means to render them inert with a thought. They do not covet your territory because they claimed everything worth having long before your species existed. They do not hate you because hatred requires that its object possess sufficient significance to merit such passion. The Eldari do not think about humanity the way you think about them. You obsess over their power, study their capabilities, fear their potential responses to various provocations. They regard you with the detached interest that a biologist might show toward a particularly intriguing strain of bacteria, worthy of observation, certainly, potentially useful for certain experimental purposes, but never for one moment considered an equal or even a junior partner in the grand project of galactic civilization. You are specimens to be maintained or discarded according to criteria you will never fully understand, because the conceptual framework required to grasp their decision-making processes is simply beyond human cognitive capacity. The void stretches out before you, cold and infinite and uncaring. Your vessel is one of thousands making similar journeys, each carrying humans who have glimpsed the truth and must now find ways to live with it. Some will succeed, some will break, some will retreat into comfortable delusions that allow them to function without confronting the fundamental horror of their existence. You do not know which category you will fall into. You only know that you will return to the border regions, will stand once more in the presence of perfection so absolute that it makes your soul ache, will file your reports and maintain your composure and pretend that any of it matters. Because perhaps it does matter. In some small way. Perhaps the accumulated observations of 1,000 human agents over 1,000 years will provide some insight that helps the Imperium navigate its relationship with the Eldari more effectively. Perhaps your species will find some way to carve out a slightly larger sphere of autonomy, to gain some measure of respect beyond mere tolerance, or perhaps not. Perhaps humanity's trajectory was set in stone millions of years ago when the Eldari first looked up at the stars and decided to claim them. Perhaps every action your species takes is simply playing out a script that the Farseers wrote before your great-grandparents were born. The ship's navigator calls out coordinates, the Gellerfields hum to life, reality shivers and parts like a curtain drawing back, and once more you plunge into the screaming madness of the fast warp, carried through nightmares toward whatever future the Aeldari have permitted humanity to possess. The journey never ends. The cycle never breaks. You exist at the pleasure of beings so far beyond your comprehension that the very attempt to understand them threatens sanity. This is what the galaxy looks like when the Eldari never fell. It is a place of staggering beauty and terrible hierarchy, where perfection reigns eternal and those who cannot match it are consigned to permanent subordination. It is a place where humanity's dreams of significance die in the cold light of reality, where every achievement is measured against standards that cannot be met and found wanting. It is a place where hope itself becomes a kind of madness, a refusal to accept the fundamental laws that govern cosmic order. The Eldari stand eternal, their empire secure, their power absolute. Their music echoes through dimensions you cannot perceive and will never perceive, a symphony that has played, uninterrupted for millions of years, and will continue long after the last human has crumbled to dust. And you, for all your struggles and aspirations, remain exactly what you have always been in this timeline, a minor character in a story written by others, permitted to speak your lines only so long as they do not disrupt the performance. The ship completes its transition, and you feel the familiar lurch as real space reasserts its grip. The Vox grill crackles with standard Imperial transmissions. The mundane chatter of cargo manifests and patrol schedules that seems almost quaint after what you have witnessed. Your fellow crew members go about their duties with mechanical precision, each one processing their experiences in their own way, each one carrying a burden that will never fully lift. You watch them and wonder how many will request transfer to other duties after this tour concludes. How many will wake screaming from dreams of wraithbone spires and psychic harmonies that their minds cannot properly process? How many will simply break quietly, their sanity eroding like cliff faces worn down by an ocean of revelations too vast to contain? The Medicae aboard your vessel reports an increase in psychological counseling requests. 3 crew members have developed symptoms consistent with what the Imperium's medical texts clinically term xenomorphic dysphoria, a condition that emerges when baseline humans spend too long in proximity to species. So fundamentally different that human cognitive frameworks cannot adequately process the experience. The symptoms vary. Some patients become obsessed with Aeldari culture, spending every waking moment studying whatever fragmentary information they can access, trying desperately to understand beings who exist on a plane of perception forever closed to human consciousness. Others develop a paralyzing sense of inadequacy, becoming unable to perform even basic tasks because they have internalized too deeply the truth of humanity's cosmic irrelevance. Still, others retreat into elaborate denial structures, constructing psychological defenses that allow them to function by simply refusing to acknowledge what they have seen. The Medicae prescribes the standard treatments: psychic dampeners to mute the residual impressions left by exposure to Aeldari presence, chemical mood stabilizers to prevent the spiraling despair that claims so many who work the border regions, mandatory counseling sessions where trained specialists help crew members construct narrative frameworks that allow them to reconcile their experiences with their need to continue functioning as productive members of Imperial society. It is patchwork at best, temporary measures to keep broken minds operational for a few more years before they finally shatter beyond any hope of recovery. The Imperium knows this. The survival rate for personnel assigned to long-term Aeldari contact duty rarely exceeds 40% across a standard career span. But the work must be done, and so bodies are fed into the machinery of observation and intelligence gathering, burned through and discarded when they can no longer serve. You attend one of the mandatory counseling sessions, despite having passed your psychological evaluations with acceptable scores. The counselor is an older woman who has spent 3 decades helping traumatized personnel process their encounters with the Xenos, and her eyes carry the weight of 1,000 broken minds. She does not waste time with pleasantries or false comfort. Instead, she asks you a single question that cuts directly to the heart of your turmoil. She asks whether you believe humanity deserves to survive. The question catches you off guard, because it forces you to confront something you have been avoiding since your vessel first entered Aeldari space. Every instinct bred into you by your upbringing in the Imperium, every doctrine and catechism and prayer, insists that humanity possesses inherent worth, that your species has a right to existence that transcends any consideration of power or capability. But against the reality you have witnessed, such assertions feel hollow. The universe does not operate on principles of fairness or deserve. It operates on power, and the Eldari possess power so absolute that philosophical questions about worthiness become meaningless. They permit humanity to continue not because humans deserve survival, but because they have not yet decided that humanity's existence inconveniences them sufficiently to warrant extermination. You tell the counselor this, and she nods with the tired recognition of someone who has heard similar confessions countless times before. She does not offer platitudes about humanity's resilience or hidden strengths. She does not suggest that the God Emperor will somehow elevate your species to challenge the Eldari dominance. Instead, she speaks about perspective and scale, about the necessity of finding meaning within the constraints that existence imposes. A single human life, she explains, can possess profound significance to the individual living it and to those who share connection with that individual, regardless of how that life registers on cosmic scales. The fact that humanity exists as a subordinate species in a galaxy dominated by the Eldari does not negate the reality of human experience, does not render meaningless the love between parent and child, the satisfaction of work well done, the beauty of art created for its own sake rather than in futile competition with Xenos perfection. Her words provide a kind of comfort, though it is cold comfort indeed. She is essentially arguing for a philosophy of radical acceptance, suggesting that the only path to psychological survival lies in abandoning any pretense that humanity matters beyond the immediate sphere of human experience. It is a retreat from cosmic significance into purely personal meaning, a narrowing of focus that allows continued function by simply refusing to engage with the larger horror. You understand the utility of this approach even as some part of you recoils from it. To accept her framework means accepting defeat, acknowledging that humanity will never be more than it currently is, that all the grand narratives of ascension and manifest destiny are lies told to keep the masses placid and productive. But what is the alternative? To rage against the fundamental structure of reality, to spend your remaining years consumed by impotent fury at the injustice of a universe that does not care about human aspirations, to join the xenophobes who whisper treason in dark corners, plotting impossible rebellions that would only accelerate humanity's destruction. The counselor watches your internal struggle with professional patience, and when you finally meet her eyes again, she offers something that might be interpreted as a smile. She tells you that every person who works these border regions must eventually make the same choice, must decide whether to find peace with humanity's limitations or to be consumed by the terrible knowledge that such limitations exist. The session ends without resolution because resolution is impossible. You return to your quarters and lie on your narrow bunk staring at the corroded pipes running along the ceiling, trying to process everything you have learned. Somewhere beyond the hull, the galaxy continues its ancient dance, stars burning and dying, civilizations rising and falling, the great currents of history flowing according to patterns too vast for any single consciousness to fully comprehend. And threading through it all, invisible to most but undeniable to those who have witnessed their majesty. The Eldari move with purpose and precision, shaping events through methods that blend prescience and power in ways that render traditional concepts of causality essentially meaningless. Sleep comes eventually, though it brings no rest. Your dreams are filled with images of wraithbone cities stretching across entire continents, of infinity circuits pulsing with the stored consciousness of billions, of farseers standing atop impossible towers, gazing into futures that branch and merge in probability patterns no human mind could map. You dream of music that rewrites the fundamental harmonics of reality, of art that exists simultaneously across multiple dimensions, of beings who have forgotten more about the nature of existence than humanity will ever learn. And you dream of silence, the terrible, suffocating silence that will descend when the Eldari finally decide that the experiment has concluded and humanity's permission to exist expires. You wake gasping, your body slick with cold sweat, and for a moment you cannot remember where you are. The ship's chrono reads 0342 hours, and from the common areas you can hear the quiet conversations of crew members on night watch. Normal sounds, human sounds, comforting in their mundanity. You force yourself to breathe slowly, to ground yourself in the immediate physical reality of your surroundings. This is your life now. This will always be your life. The knowledge you carry cannot be unlearned, cannot be forgotten, and it will color every moment of your remaining existence. 3 more weeks pass before you receive your new assignment. The orders arrive via encrypted data crystal, and you read them in the privacy of your quarters with growing resignation. You are being transferred to a listening post on the very edge of Aeldari space, one of dozens of such installations that the Imperium maintains to monitor Xenos activity. The post is small, barely 50 personnel, and its primary function is to observe and record any changes in Aeldari ship movements through a nearby webway nexus. It is quiet duty, the kind of posting that sees very little action but that grinds down the personnel assigned to it through sheer psychological attrition. You will spend your days watching gods come and go, tracking their movements with instruments barely sophisticated enough to register their presence, filing reports that will be read by analysts who have never stood in Aeldari presence and therefore cannot truly understand what your data represents. The transport to your new posting takes a month, and you use the time to study everything the Imperium has compiled about the Eldari's history and capabilities. The records are fragmentary and often contradictory, assembled from millennia of observations by personnel whose understanding was limited by human cognitive constraints. Reading them is an exercise in frustration because the gaps in knowledge vastly outweigh the confirmed facts. The Eldari do not share their history with lesser species, do not explain their motivations or strategies, and any insights humanity has gained have been pieced together from inference and speculation rather than direct knowledge. One document catches your attention: a classified report submitted by a rogue trader who claimed to have encountered an Aeldari archaeological expedition in a region of space that predated even the Aeldari Empire's rise. According to the trader's account, the expedition was studying the ruins of a civilization that had existed long before the Aeldari achieved sapience, a species whose technology surpassed even current Aeldari capabilities. The expedition leader, a farseer of tremendous age and power, had spoken briefly with the trader and shared a fragment of perspective that the human had struggled to convey in his report. The farseer explained that the Aeldari understood their own position in cosmic history better than humanity might imagine, that they knew they were not the first species to achieve galactic dominance and would almost certainly not be the last. Their long reign, measured in millions of years, was still only a brief candle against the infinite darkness of time. The report had been flagged by inquisitorial censors and nearly destroyed before cooler heads recognized its potential intelligence value. The implications troubled the Ordo Xenos considerably. If the Aeldari themselves acknowledged that their dominance was temporary, if they recognized that eventually some other species would rise to challenge and perhaps surpass them, what did that mean for their current policies toward humanity? Were they preparing the galaxy for their eventual decline, carefully managing lesser species to ensure some form of stability would persist after they had faded? Or were they simply acknowledging an abstract philosophical truth while remaining confident that such a transition lay millions or billions of years in the future, well beyond any practical concern? You read the report 3 times, each reading generating more questions than answers. The rogue trader who had filed it had disappeared shortly afterward, and subsequent attempts to locate the archaeological site he described had failed. The Eldari, if they knew of the Imperium's interest in the matter, had given no indication. The entire incident existed in your files as a tantalizing fragment, a glimpse into how the Aeldari might view their own position in the cosmic order, but too incomplete to draw any firm conclusions from. The listening post, when you finally arrive, is exactly as depressing as you anticipated. A small station clinging to a barren asteroid, shielded from detection by technology that the Mechanicus barely understands and certainly cannot replicate. The previous crew cycles out with visible relief, their haunted eyes and nervous mannerisms testimony to the psychological toll of the assignment. The outgoing commander briefs you with practiced efficiency, covering the technical aspects of operating the monitoring equipment and the protocols for reporting Aeldari activity. He does not mention the isolation, the crushing awareness of your own insignificance, or the way that watching Aeldari vessels flow through the webway nexus day after day gradually erodes your sense of purpose. He does not need to. You can see it written in every line of his face, in the way his hands shake slightly as he transfers command access codes. Your first week on station passes in a blur of adjustment and familiarization. The equipment is sophisticated by Imperial standards, but laughably primitive when measured against what you observed in Aeldari space. Your sensors can detect when ships enter or exit the webway, can approximate their size and energy signatures, but cannot penetrate the dimensional barriers enough to actually observe what transpires within those ancient corridors. You are essentially watching shadows on a wall, recording the echoes of activity taking place in spaces you cannot perceive, trying to derive meaningful intelligence from data so limited as to be almost useless. The personnel under your command are a mix of technicians, analysts, and security staff, 47. Men and women who drew the unlucky assignment to spend years watching gods travel routes humanity will never access. Many of them have developed coping mechanisms that border on the pathological. Some have retreated so far into routine that they perform their duties with mechanical precision, devoid of any genuine engagement. Others have become obsessed with minor details, finding meaning in tracking the slight variations in energy signatures or the timing of vessel transits, desperate to convince themselves that their work matters. A few have simply broken, going through the motions while waiting for their tour to end so they can request reassignment to any duty that does not require confronting the reality of Aeldari supremacy on a daily basis. You try to maintain morale through the standard approaches, regular crew meetings to discuss observations and theories, mandatory recreation periods to prevent personnel from spending every waking moment at their stations, counseling sessions for those showing signs of psychological deterioration. It is exhausting work made harder by the fact that you share all the doubts and despair that afflict your crew. You are asking them to find meaning in meaningless labor, to maintain discipline in the face of cosmic irrelevance, to convince themselves that their observations contribute to something larger when you yourself struggle to believe such claims. The Eldari vessels come and go with variable frequency. Some days the nexus lies quiet, the webway gates sealed, and you begin to wonder if perhaps something has changed in their inscrutable plans. Other days you record dozens of transits, ships of every size and configuration flowing through the dimensional barriers with casual ease. You catalog each sighting, note the energy signatures and estimated masses, file your reports with the administratum, knowing that they will be added to vast databases where patterns might eventually emerge. It is intelligence work at its most, tedious, the accumulation of data points that individually mean nothing but which might, if collected in sufficient quantity over sufficient time, reveal something of value. 3 months into your assignment, something different happens. A vessel emerges from the webway that does not match any configuration in your database. It is massive, easily twice the size of the largest Aeldari cruiser you have previously observed, and its energy signature makes your instruments scream warnings about imminent overload. The design is unmistakably Aeldari, flowing lines and impossible geometries, but there is something about it that sets your nerves on edge. Your senior analyst, a woman who has spent a decade studying Aeldari ship classifications, stares at the sensor readouts with an expression of profound unease. She tells you that the vessel's design incorporates elements that predate the current Aeldari Empire, architectural principles that have not been used in active construction for millions of years. The ship holds position near the webway nexus for precisely 3 hours and 17 minutes. During that time, smaller vessels emerge to meet it, courier craft and escort ships that surround the massive vessel in formations that your analyst describes as ceremonial rather than defensive. Whatever is happening, it represents something significant in Aeldari terms, an event important enough to warrant the deployment of a vessel that has been in storage or reserve for epochs. You record everything with meticulous care, knowing that this represents the kind of anomalous activity that might actually warrant immediate attention from your superiors. Then, without warning, every instrument on your station simultaneously fails, not gradually, not with any preliminary signs of malfunction, but instantly and completely. Your sensor arrays go dark. Your communication systems die. Even backup power flickers and threatens to fail entirely. The blackout lasts for exactly 37 seconds, and in that brief window, you experience a moment of pure terror as you realize that the Eldari have noticed your observation post. They know you are here. They have always known you are here, and they have just demonstrated with casual ease that they could extinguish your station and everyone aboard it without expending any notable effort. Power returns as suddenly as it vanished. Your instruments reboot, running through diagnostic cycles that reveal no damage, no malfunction, nothing to explain what just occurred. When your sensors come back online, the massive vessel has vanished back into the webway, and the smaller craft have dispersed to whatever destinations they serve. You sit in your command chair, feeling the adrenaline drain from your system, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. The message could not have been clearer. You exist here because the Eldari permit it. You observe because they allow it, and if they ever decide that your presence offends them, your existence will end with the same casual ease with which one might snuff out a candle. Your crew handles the incident better than you expected, though perhaps that speaks more to how thoroughly they have already accepted humanity's subordinate position than to any particular courage on their part. You file a priority report describing the anomalous vessel and the subsequent power failure, and 3 weeks later you receive a terse acknowledgement that your observations have been noted and added to ongoing intelligence assessments. Nothing changes. The duty continues. The Aeldari vessels come and go, and you watch and record and try to find meaning in the shadows. The months blur together into a continuous grey expanse of routine and observation. You lose track of the standard calendar, your sense of time becoming untethered from anything except the shift rotations and transit logs. Your crew develops the hollow-eyed look that characterizes everyone who spends too long in these positions, the visible manifestation of souls being slowly ground down by the weight of truth. You conduct counseling sessions and approve requests for medical leave and write performance evaluations, maintaining the bureaucratic machinery of command even as you feel your own psychological reserves depleting. One of your analysts, a young man barely into his 3rd decade, requests a private meeting. He has been compiling data from your station and dozens of others scattered along the Eldari border, cross-referencing transit patterns and vessel movements to look for larger trends. What he has found troubles him enough that he felt compelled to bring it to your attention, despite knowing that doing so marks him as someone who thinks too much, who looks too deeply, who will likely never be trusted with sensitive assignments again. He shows you charts and projections that suggest the Aeldari have been gradually reducing their presence in certain sectors while increasing activity in others. The pattern is subtle, barely visible even when aggregated across decades of data, but it exists. The analyst's interpretation is that the Aeldari are repositioning resources in preparation for something, some event or development that they have foreseen and are moving to address. Whether this development poses a threat to humanity remains unclear, but the analyst notes that several of the sectors being depopulated include regions where human expansion has been most aggressive. He speculates, cautiously and with appropriate disclaimers, that perhaps the Aeldari have decided to grant humanity slightly more autonomy, to withdraw from direct management in certain areas and observe how your species handles increased independence. Or perhaps, more ominously, they are simply clearing the field before addressing some problem that will require destructive solutions. You listen to his analysis and recognize both its value and its danger. If he is correct, if the Aeldari truly are implementing some long-term strategic shift, then humanity needs to understand what that shift entails and how to position itself to survive whatever comes next. But pursuing this line of investigation too aggressively risks drawing Aeldari attention in ways that could prove catastrophic. You are reminded of the vessel that casually shut down your station's power, the effortless demonstration that you exist on sufferance. The question is whether humanity's need to understand outweighs the risk of being noticed by beings who prefer their test subjects remain unaware that they are being studied. You make the decision that your position requires. You classify the analyst's work at the highest level, restrict access to yourself and a handful of trusted personnel, and begin compiling a comprehensive report for the Ordo Xenos. The work will take months, perhaps years, to complete properly. Every conclusion must be carefully hedged, every speculation appropriately flagged, because making definitive claims about Aeldari intentions based on incomplete data is the kind of error that destroys careers and potentially entire organizations. But the pattern exists, and someone needs to be investigating what it means. And you find yourself volunteering for that burden because the alternative is sitting idle while potentially critical intelligence goes unexamined. The work provides a strange kind of purpose to your days. Instead of merely recording transits and filing routine reports, you begin to see yourself as part of a larger project, an attempt to understand the masters of the galaxy well enough to ensure humanity's continued survival when they inevitably shift their attention elsewhere. It is probably delusion, a psychological defense mechanism to render tolerable the grinding horror of your assignment, but you embrace it anyway because the alternative is surrendering to despair. Your second year on station begins with a communication from the administratum informing you that your tour of duty has been extended indefinitely. The message offers no explanation beyond noting that your performance has been satisfactory and that the Imperium requires experienced personnel to maintain monitoring operations. You read between the lines easily enough. The psychological attrition rate for border station commanders has increased, and qualified replacements are scarce. You are functional, relatively stable, and have demonstrated the capacity to maintain operational efficiency despite the soul-crushing nature of the work. Therefore, you will remain at your post until you break, or until some shift in Imperial policy renders the station unnecessary. You inform your crew of the extension and watch their faces carefully for signs of how they receive the news. A few show visible relief, having grown comfortable with the routine despite its psychological cost. Others display resignation tinged with despair, understanding that they too will likely see their tours extended until they reach whatever breaking point the Imperium has deemed acceptable. One crew member, a senior technician who has served with distinction for 18 months, quietly requests transfer to any other duty, regardless of danger or hardship. You approve the request without comment because you understand perfectly. Some truths become too heavy to carry, and continued exposure to Aeldari supremacy has finally exceeded her capacity to endure. The galaxy continues its ancient dance, and you continue watching from your isolated perch on its very edge. The Aeldari vessels flow through their dimensional corridors, and you record their passage with instruments barely adequate to the task. Your reports join thousands of others in the vast archives of the administratum, data points in a collection so large that deriving meaning from it requires analytical resources the Imperium can barely spare. And somewhere, in the soaring cities of the Eldari Empire, The Farseers who truly govern galactic affairs occasionally glance toward the regions where humanity struggles to maintain its fragile civilization and make decisions that will determine whether your species survives another millennium. This is your life now. This is the reality that defines existence for every human who truly understands the nature of the galaxy they inhabit. You are permitted to exist, permitted to build your cities and fleets and forge worlds, permitted to dream your small dreams of significance. And all of it depends on the continued indifference of beings so far beyond your comprehension that the very attempt to understand them threatens sanity. The Eldari never fell. They stand eternal, their empire unbroken, their mastery absolute. And humanity, for all its struggles and pretensions, remains exactly what it has always been. A species existing in the margins of someone else's story, hoping desperately that the authors never decide to edit them out entirely.